The midnight regular, the antique clock above Moonbeam Cafe's entrance, chimed 11 times. Its brass pendulum catching the warm glow of Edison bulbs strung along exposed brick walls. Nora Chen looked up from wiping down the espresso machine, already knowing who would walk through that heavy wooden door. Like clockwork, he appeared, tall frames silhouetted against the amber streetlight, a dark hair slightly tousled by the autumn wind. "Evening," he said with that same quiet smile, settling into his usual corner booth. Table 7, always table 7. Positioned perfectly to observe the entire cafe while remaining partially hidden behind a towering fiddle-leaf fig. "The usual?" Nora called, though she'd already begun preparing his order. "Double espresso, splash of steamed milk, no sugar. Simple, like everything else about their interaction." He nodded, pulling out that worn leather journal she'd grown curious about over the past 6 months. Its cover was weathered to a soft brown, edges frayed from countless handling. Sometimes he wrote, pen moving in careful strokes across cream-colored pages. Other nights, like tonight, he simply read, occasionally pausing to gaze thoughtfully at nothing in particular. Nora had worked plenty of late shifts during her 3 years at Moonbeam, but this customer intrigued her more than any regular she'd encountered. Most night owls were predictably insomniacs seeking caffeine fixes, students cramming for exams or workers ending double shifts. But James She'd learned his name from credit card receipts seemed different. He possessed an almost meditative stillness, as if the cafe served as his sanctuary rather than merely a pit stop. She approached his table, ceramic cup balanced on a small wooden tray alongside a single biscotti. "Here you go. Thank you, Nora." His voice carried warmth that contrasted with his reserved demeanor. He always left a $20 tip for a $4 coffee, waving away her protests with gentle insistence. "Quiet night?" she ventured, attempting conversation, as she had countless times before. "The best kind," he replied, fingers tracing the journal's spine. "I find peace in the silence between words." Such responses were typical, poetic, yet vague, inviting yet distant. Nora lingered, studying his profile as he gazed toward the large windows facing Maple Street. The cafe's reflection created a dreamlike double image, making the scene appear almost surreal. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. James looked up, dark eyes meeting hers directly for perhaps the first time. "Close enough." Pause, then softer. "Do you enjoy working nights? It pays the bills?" She shrugged, then found herself continuing. "I'm an artist store trying to be. Days are for painting, nights are for surviving." Something flickered across. His expression interest, perhaps approval. "What do you paint?" "Cityscapes mostly. The way light changes everything, transforms ordinary places into something magical." She gestured toward the windows. "It's like how different this street looks at midnight compared to noon." "Light reveals truth," he murmured, attention returning. To his journal, "Sometimes we need darkness to appreciate illumination." Nora retreated to the counter, pondering his words while cleaning equipment that was already spotless. The cafe felt different when James occupied table 7, more intimate, charged with unspoken possibilities. She sketched him sometimes during slow moments, capturing his contemplative poses, the way shadows played across his angular features. At exactly midnight, he closed the journal, finished his espresso, and stood. "Good night, Nora. Sweet dreams." "See you tomorrow," she replied, though it sounded more like a question. After he left, she always found herself watching through the window as he disappeared down Maple Street, hands deep in coat pockets, walking with purpose toward destinations she could only imagine. The cafe felt emptier without his quiet presence, as if some essential energy had departed with him. Nora locked up at 2 a.m., her artistic mind all ready, conjuring new ways to capture the mysterious magnetism of Table 7's occupant. Storm confessions. First drops of rain began pelting Moonbeam Cafe's windows at 10:30, each droplet creating intricate patterns as it slid down the glass. By 11, the autumn storm had transformed into a full assault thunder rolling through the city like distant cannons. Lightning illuminating the cafe in stark, dramatic flashes. Nora watched the empty street through rain-streaked windows, wondering if her mysterious regular would brave the weather. She'd grown more accustomed to his presence than she cared to admit, and the thought of spending the night alone felt oddly disappointing. At 11:15, the door burst open with a gust of wind and rain. James stood in the doorway thoroughly. Soaked, dark hair plastered against his forehead, his wool coat dripping steadily onto the worn hardwood floor. Terrible night to be out, Nora called, already preparing his usual order. Or perfect, depending on your perspective, he replied, shaking droplets from his jacket. Instead of heading to table 7, he approached the counter directly. An unprecedented deviation from their established routine. You're drenched, she observed, handing him a clean towel from behind the espresso machine. Thank you. Accepted the towel gratefully, running it through his hair. I got caught 3 blocks away when the sky opened up. Figured I might as well continue rather than turn back. Dedicated to your caffeine habit, Nora teased, surprised by her own playfulness. Something like that. His smile seemed different tonight, less guarded or genuine. She was reaching for his espresso when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in briefly before failing as well, plunging the cafe into near-total darkness, save for sporadic lightning flashes. Well, James's voice carried a note of amusement. This is unexpected. Gosh. Nora fumbled beneath the counter for the flashlight she knew was there somewhere. I'm sorry, this has never happened before. The backup generator must be. Don't apologize. His tone was gentle. Sometimes the universe forces us to slow down. She located the flashlight, its beam creating a warm circle of light between them. Should probably close early, but with this storm, ... mind if I waited out here? My car is 6 blocks away, and I'd rather not navigate flooded streets in the dark. Of course. The words escaped before she could consider the implications. Here was her mystery man, stranded in her workplace, stripped of the formal distance. Their usual interactions maintained. They settled at a table near the windows, the flashlight positioned between them like a campfire. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity, transforming familiar Maple Street into an alien landscape of rushing water and bending trees. Tell me about your art, James said suddenly, leaning forward in his chair. Earlier you mentioned cityscapes. Nora found herself opening up in ways she rarely did, describing her obsession with urban light, how neon signs reflected in puddles could transform concrete into poetry, how shadows between buildings created secret worlds. She talked about her tiny studio apartment, walls covered with canvases, depicting the city at different hours and various weather conditions. I keep trying to capture something indefinable, she admitted. That moment when ordinary becomes extraordinary. You mean like now? James gestured toward the storm-transformed street. This cafe looks nothing like it did an hour ago. Studied his profile in the flashlight's glow. Exactly. You understand that. I understand the power of perspective. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. What made you choose art over more? ... Practical pursuits? Who says I chose? Nora laughed softly. Art chose me. I tried accounting, lasted 2 semesters, attempted marketing, made it through 1 internship. But I kept returning to painting, kept seeing the world in compositions. And color palettes? And your family supports this choice? They worry. She shrugged. Immigrant parents, you know. They sacrificed everything for stability, and here I am choosing uncertainty. James nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the greatest risk is not taking one. Speaking from experience? In a way, its expression grew distant. I spent years convinced that safety meant staying invisible, never making waves. It took time to realize that invisibility can become its own prison. Thunder crashed overhead so close the building seemed to shudder. In the sudden silence that followed, Nora became acutely aware of how intimate their conversation had become. How the storm had stripped away the careful boundaries they'd maintained for months. What about you? She asked. What do you do when you're not sitting in corner booths with mysterious journals? James hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might deflect as usual. Instead, he said simply, I watch. I listen. I try to understand. The story's happening around me. That sounds lonely. He admitted, eyes meeting hers in the flashlight's warm glow. Until recently. The power flickered back on, harsh fluorescence, destroying the storm-created intimacy. They blinked in the sudden brightness, the spell temporarily broken, but something fundamental had shifted between them, and they both knew there was no going back. The revelation 3 weeks after the storm, autumn had surrendered to winter's first breath. Nora arrived for her Thursday night shift to find Mrs. Patterson, the cafe manager, practically vibrating with excitement behind the counter. The older woman's silver hair was perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Her usually stern expression had been replaced by something approaching glee. "Nora, dear, I have the most wonderful news," Mrs. Patterson announced, before Nora had even removed. Her coat, Moonbeam Calf, has been sold. The words hit like cold water. Sold. Nora's hand stilled on her scarf. When, to whom? Oh, don't look so worried. The new owner specifically requested to keep all current staff. In fact, he's planning extensive renovations while maintaining the cafe's character. Mrs. Patterson clasped her hands together. New equipment, expanded seating, possibly even live music nights? Nora forced a smile while her mind raced. Changes meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant potential job loss, despite Mrs. Patterson's assurances. Her art supplies were expensive. Her studio rent was already 2 months behind, and this job represented the thin thread keeping her dreams viable. Do we know anything about the new owner?" she asked, hanging her coat on the familiar hook behind the counter. "James Rivera," Mrs. Patterson read from a folder thick with legal documents. "Local businessman, apparently. Very hands-on approach to his investments. He's been quietly observing operations for months before making an offer." The name struck Nora like lightning. She gripped the counter's edge, certain she'd misheard. "Did you say James Rivera?" "Yes. Do you know him?" "Lovely man, very soft-spoken. Was quite complimentary about our night shift service specifically." Mrs. Patterson beamed, said he'd heard excellent things about our late-night atmosphere. Nora's vision blurred momentarily. Café like a specimen under glass. Every conversation, every shared smile, every moment of perceived connection had been a lie. "Are you all right, dear? You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine." The words tasted like ash, just surprised by the news. Mrs. Patterson continued chattering about renovation timelines and exciting possibilities, but Nora heard nothing through the roar of betrayal in her ears. A go? Had their entire relationship been some elaborate performance review? The evening dragged interminably. Each familiar task, grinding coffee beans, steaming milk, wiping tables, felt mechanical, disconnected. Nora found herself staring at table 7, that corner booth that had seemed so romantic in its mysterious isolation. Oh, it looked like a surveillance post. At exactly 11 p.m., James entered as always, same quiet smile, same purposeful stride toward his usual seat. But tonight, Nora saw calculation in his movements, strategy behind his gentle demeanor. "Evening," he said, settling. "Into the booth, Mr. Rivera?" She let his real surname hang in the air between them like a blade. He froze halfway through removing his journal from his coat pocket. She approached his table slowly, coffee pot in hand, despite having no intention of serving him. "'Cause I'm genuinely curious how you explain 6 months of lies." "I never lied to you." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You never told me. You owned this place." The words erupted louder than intended, echoing off the brick walls. "You sat here night after night, watching me work, listening to me worry about money, about my future, about whether I could afford to keep pursuing our tand. You knew. You knew you held my livelihood in your hands." James stood slowly, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. What wasn't supposed to happen? The purchase, the deception, or getting caught? Caring about you. The admission stopped her cold. "I bought this cafe because it's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather opened it in 1952. My father ran it until he died 5 years ago. I sold it after his death because I couldn't handle the memories, but I've regretted that decision every day since." Nora stared at him, coffee pot trembling in her grip. "I started coming here 6 months ago to see what the new owners had done to the place," he continued. "I planned to hate it, to confirm I'd made the right choice selling. Instead, I found you. So you decided to buy it back, And keep your little barista pet? I decided to buy it back because watching you work here, seeing how you transformed this space with your presence, made me remember why my family loved it so much. His dark eyes pleaded with her. You brought life back to these walls, Nora. You made me remember that some things are worth fighting for. The coffee pot slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of glass and dark liquid. Get out. Her voice was deadly quiet. Please, let me get out of my cafe. Nora, it's not your cafe yet, Mr. Rivera. And as long as I'm working this shift, you're not welcome here. He stood there for a long moment, jacket half in, journal clutched in white-knuckled fingers. Then, without another word, he walked to the door and disappeared into the winter night. Nora sank into the nearest chair. Next evening, Nora arrived at work to find an envelope propped against the espresso machine. Her name written in the careful script she'd watched fill journal pages for months. Inside, a single key and a note, third-floor apartment, 247 Maple Street. The rest of the story is there, if you want to hear it. Then retrieved it 5 minutes later. 247 Maple Street stood. 3 blocks from the cafe, a narrow Victorian building squeezed between a bookshop and a vintage clothing store. Nora had passed it countless times, but never really noticed the faded brass numbers above its burgundy door. The key turned easily, revealing a steep staircase that creaked under her reluctant footsteps. The third-floor apartment door hung open. James sat at a small kitchen table, still as stone, staring at a collection of photographs spread before him, like tarot cards. He looked up when she entered, hope flickering across his features before settling into resignation. Nora remained in the doorway, arms crossed, not reconciliation. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. The apartment surprised hers, sparse but warm, with exposed brick walls and tall windows overlooking Maple Street. Canvases leaned against every available surface, but these weren't her urban landscapes. These were portraits of the cafe through different eras, painted with intimate knowledge of every corner, every angle of light. You're an artist too, she said, unable to mask her surprise. Haven't painted in years. James gestured toward the photographs on the table. These are what I wanted to show you. Against her better judgment, Nora approached. The black and white images chronicled decades of cafe life, a young couple sharing coffee in the 1950s. Families gathered around mismatched tables in the 60s. What looked like the early 2000s. A middle-aged man with James's eyes standing behind the counter. Arm around a woman with kind features and silver-streaked hair. My parents, Marcus and Elena Rivera, James said softly. They met at that cafe. She was a regular. He was the owner's son, working summers to pay for art school. Sound familiar? Despite her anger, Nora found herself studying the couple's faces. The resemblance between James and his father was striking. Same dark hair, same contemplative expression. Dad never finished art school. Grandfather had a heart attack senior year, and someone had to run the cafe. But Mom encouraged his painting. He'd work all day, then paint all night, mostly scenes of the cafe. The regulars, the way light changed throughout the day. James pulled out a leather portfolio, revealing sketches that made Nora's breath catch. Marcus Rivera had possessed extraordinary talent, capturing not just physical details, but the emotional essence of his subjects. After Mom died 3 years ago, Dad stopped painting, stopped doing much of anything, really. The cafe became a burden instead of a blessing. When he passed, I couldn't bear to keep it, sold to the first buyer who made an offer. So why the charade? Nora's voice had lost some of its edge. Why not just tell me who you were? 'Cause I was ashamed. James met her eyes directly. Abandoned my family's legacy, sold the place my parents fell in love, where they built their life together. I convinced myself it was practical, mature. But really I was running from grief. He stood, walking to the window that offered a perfect view of Moonbeam Cafe's warm glow. When I started visiting 6 months ago, I told myself I was conducting due diligence, making sure the new owners were treating the place well. But watching you work, seeing how you cared about every customer, how you brought the same attention to a late-night coffee that my parents brought to every aspect of their business. He trailed off, hands pressed against the window frame. Started falling in love with two things simultaneously, you and the memory of what that cafe could be. Nora approached the journal, seeing her own name scattered across pages of careful handwriting. I was going to tell you tonight, actually, before Mrs. Patterson beat me to it. She read fragments of his unsent letters, apologies, explanations, declarations of feelings he'd been too afraid to voice aloud. What happens now? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. That depends on you, James said quietly. The cafe's yours if you want it. New beginnings, 2 months later, snow-dusted Maple Street like powdered sugar on dark velvet. Nora stood before a freshly painted sign reading Moonbeam and Rivera Gallery Café, watching workmen install the last window display case. Inside, her cityscapes hung alongside Marcus Rivera's portraits, creating a visual dialogue between past and present. Between two artists who had found inspiration in the same sacred space, the bell above the door chimed as James entered. Carrying a box of promotional flyers and wearing paint-splattered jeans that made him look younger, less guarded than the mysterious figure who had once haunted Table 7. The photographer from City Arts magazine called, he announced, setting the box on the counter. They want to feature us in their spring issue, When Love Meets Legacy, How-To Artists. Transformed a family cafe into community art space. That's wonderful. Nora stepped back from the display case, Kay admiring how the afternoon light played across the mixed media. Piece she'd completed just last week, a painting of the cafe during the storm night when everything changed. With fragments of Marcus's sketches collaged into the composition. The past 2 months had been a careful dance of rebuilding trust while constructing something entirely new. After that night in James's apartment, surrounded by his father's paintings and the weight of 3 generations of cafe history, Nora had made a choice that surprised them both. I'll stay, she had told him, but as your partner, not your employee. The negotiation had taken weeks. Lawyers, contracts, lengthy conversations about artistic vision and business responsibility. James had insisted on giving her equal ownership, despite her protests about financial contribution. You're bringing something more valuable than money. He had argued, you're bringing the future. And watching him arrange flyers for tomorrow's grand reopening, Nora marveled at how naturally they had learned to work together. James handled the business side with quiet efficiency while she curated exhibitions and managed the artistic program. In the evenings, after closing, they often painted side by side. He was slowly rediscovering his own artistic voice while she experimented with new techniques inspired by Marcus's work. Nervous about tomorrow? James asked, joining her at the window. Excited, she corrected. We've created something beautiful here. The cafe looked nothing like its previous incarnation, yet somehow felt more authentically itself than ever. They had kept the exposed brick walls and vintage lighting, but added gallery quality. Display systems and a small performance space for poetry readings and acoustic sets. The corner booth table 7 remained untouched, marked with a small brass plaque reading reserved for love stories in progress. Mrs. Patterson called this morning, James said. She wanted to wish us luck and mentioned that 3 couples who met here have gotten engaged this month. Must be something in the coffee. Must be. His arm slipped around her waist, a gesture that still sent warmth through her chest, despite its growing familiarity. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, built on a foundation of shared creative passion rather than mysterious attraction. The James she knew now bore little resemblance to the enigmatic figure who had once occupied her imagination. This version laughed at her terrible jokes, argued passionately about artistic technique, and left sweet notes in the margins of books he thought she might enjoy. The door chimed again, admitting Vivian Torres, the local art critic whose review could make or break their opening night. Miss Chen, Mr. Rivera. Vivian shook their hands professionally, then allowed herself a small smile. I must admit, when I heard about this collaboration, I was skeptical. Gallery cafes often prioritize commerce over artistic integrity. This ... she gestured around the transformed space. This is something special. Thank you, Nora said, meaning it deeply. The way you've integrated historical and contemporary work creates a genuine dialogue. And using the cafe as both exhibition space and living artwork? Brilliant. Your father would be proud, Vivian added to James. After she left, they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the street transform in the fading light. Tomorrow would bring crowds, critics, and the ultimate test of whether their vision could sustain itself financially. But tonight, in the quiet space they had created together, Nora felt the deep satisfaction of dreams made manifest. Do you ever miss it? James asked. The simplicity of before? When I was just the mysterious customer and you were just the night shift barista? Nora considered the question, remembering the electric uncertainty of those early months. The way anticipation had flavored every interaction. No, she said finally, mystery is intoxicating, but partnership is sustaining. James tilted her chin up, studying her face in the gallery lighting. I love you, Nora Chen.
I love you too, James Rivera.
He kissed her softly, and in that moment, surrounded by art and possibility, Nora understood that the most beautiful transformations happened not in single dramatic revelations, but in the quiet daily choice to build something meaningful together. Outside, snow continued to fall on Maple Street, dusting their sign with winter magic, promising that some stories were just beginning.